Tips from Trestle is brought to you by the Boelter Companies, Navigator Group Purchasing, and eMenuChoice Point of Sale. Welcome to Tips from Trestle, the Senior Living Food and Hospitality Podcast. This podcast explores the senior living industry with a unique focus on food, hospitality, and the community experience. I'm your host, Aaron Fish. During 3 decades in the hospitality industry, I focused my work on creating exceptional experiences for the customers we serve. My goal for this podcast? Educate, inform, and inspire leaders in senior living. How? By creating hospitality with a purpose, by bringing the customer experience to the front of mind in our industry. We should bring the passionate spirit of food and hospitality to everything that we do and everyone we serve each and every day. So what are we waiting for? Let's get to it. Today on Tips from Trestle, I'm joined by Adria Thompson. Adria is a licensed speech-language pathologist with over 9 years of experience in dementia care. She is owner of Be Light Care Consulting, where she creates educational content for professional and personal caregivers on social media platforms. She holds a master's and bachelor's degree in communication disorders from Eastern Kentucky University. Adria, thanks for joining me today on Tips from Trestle.
Thank you, Aaron, for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, so tell us what got you, being a speech-language pathologist, that's pretty specialized background. How did you get into that? What kind of was your driver in doing that? And then how'd you get into the senior living space?
Yeah, so I want to make a clarification at the very beginning for any listeners. A speech language pathologist and a speech therapist is the same thing. I found that when I use those terms interchangeably, it can confuse people sometimes, but
Yeah.
So it's the same thing. You'll hear me say both. So I never grew up knowing I wanted to be a speech therapist. I went into college undeclared, and I took a career counseling class my sophomore year. And I took a bunch of personality aptitude tests, and it came back saying that I would make a great fit for a speech language pathologist. And I didn't know what that was. And once I read about it, I had to write a paper about it. I realized, oh, that's the same thing as a speech therapist. And I actually got speech therapy for 5 years when I was in elementary school for articulation. I couldn't say my R's and my S's.
Okay.
So yeah, I had some personal experience on that side of things with working with children. And so once I declared that major, started taking classes, I fell in love with it. But I was, even through grad school, I was dead set on working with children. And I really liked working with children with severe disabilities, a lot of nonverbal kiddos. And I loved creating alternative and augmentative communication devices for those who couldn't speak. And I thought that's the path I was going to take. And so after I graduated, I just started applying to a bunch of random jobs because I had really not had any experience with, professional interviews and just that whole job seeking experience after actually having a degree.
Right.
And I applied for a job at a nursing home. And I loved the people, and it was a good offer, for someone right out of school. And so I thought, well, I can do this for a little while. And I very quickly just fell in love with it. I realized that it wasn't necessarily the children that I loved. It was the challenge, working with individuals who a lot of others had given up on, or we didn't have high expectations for. And so that is kind of how I fell into loving working with people with dementia, because I feel like it kind of scratches that same itch.
Yeah, no, it's so fascinating to me every time I ask people about their stories and how they got into the space. There are more people than not that have stumbled into the industry and realized, like what you said, that it wasn't what they were thinking, but it was more of the challenge or the relationships or something along those lines that really brought them in and kept them in the space. And so You pointed out that speech language pathologists, speech therapists are the same thing, but I think a lot of times people don't really understand what a speech therapist does. I know when I was early in senior living, I was like, what is that all about?
Mhm.
That doesn't make any, how is that relevant to like food and eating? And so, which is something I definitely get into, but um, tell the listeners a little bit, what is a speech therapist? What do they do? What does their role in the senior living community look like?
Yeah, it is a very misunderstood and under-referred profession. So, a speech therapist across the lifespan, it doesn't matter what age someone is. We work with babies in the NICU all the way up to someone at the end of life. And so, but there are three main areas, regardless of what setting you work in, that we are the experts in. And so, first is probably the most obvious, which is communication. So it's in our name. We think of a speech therapist just helping someone speak, right? But
Yep.
communication, even in and of itself, is far more than speaking. Communication is has two main sections. That's expressive language, which speaking does fall into, but also writing, and then comprehension. So comprehensive language, which is understanding, but also reading. And so across the lifespan, we help people who have any kind of disorder in communication. We can assess, diagnose, and treat. And then the second is swallowing, which is totally not in our name and completely like random seemingly for most people.
Right.
But yeah, we are the medical professionals that are experts in swallowing disorders. So a swallowing disorder is called dysphagia,
Mhm.
and we can diagnose, assess, and treat individuals of all ages. And then the third is cognition. So that is just thinking, any kind of thinking task. That's memory, problem solving, like calculation, any of those deficits we can assess, diagnose, and treat. And so that's across the lifespan for kids and even older adults, but specifically in senior care. Most of the time, what we're doing, of course, is that classic, what people think of, which is maybe someone has had a stroke and they lose their ability to speak.
Mhm.
We will do some rehabilitation services to try to help them regain their ability to speak. We do a lot with voice, especially individuals with Parkinson's disease will start to have decreased articulation accuracy. So they'll sound a little bit slurred, but then also their speech gets quieter. So we can provide care there. But individuals with dementia, by and large, will have deficits in communication, in swallowing, and of course, they have difficulty thinking.
Yeah.
So they are, I mean, I feel like it's the most obvious fit for our services once you understand kind of what we do. But we work with any individual with any issue in all three of those areas.
Yeah, I think the last one, the cognition, that would be one that I don't think most people would think about, right? Because I know from my experience, anytime I was working with a speech therapist, it typically revolved around diets and swallowing, and that was the primary focus. But there's so much more to that, and it's all kind of interrelated when you really think
Definitely.
about it. And so,
Well, and
um,
also I was going to say, occupational therapists also will do cognitive treatment, but the kind of difference between what a speech therapist and an occupational therapist can do is we kind of draw the line between occupational therapists deal with cognition as it relates to function. So when someone is like doing a task, maybe they are brushing their teeth, how might cognition be impacting like any kind of problems with memory or sequencing, like one step after the other? How is it
mhm,
affecting someone's ability to get a task done? But speech therapists, we look at how is cognition impacting someone's ability to communicate, because we have all encountered individuals, especially with dementia, who might talk, I'm putting this in quotes, but just fine, right? They talk just fine.
yeah.
But when they speak, it doesn't make any sense, right? It's not accurate. It's like it's a super confused interaction that you have. And so that is kind of OTs and speech therapists. We co-treat a lot. We are hand in hands, like we work together, but that's kind of our specialties.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. And so, obviously, one of the things I wanted to talk a little bit more with you about is that second one, the swallowing and all of that, because When you think about, being a food service professional in senior living, typically we're dealing with that the most in dementia patients and those who are going, like after a stroke or someone who needs support with that. And so, what are some things that we should know about the swallowing? What we should look for as professionals, and how can we better support that whole process in our communities?
Yeah. So when someone has a swallowing disorder, sometimes it can be really obvious, right? We might see someone in the dining room while they're eating, coughing, or even just like completely getting choked, their airway being cut off. They need a Heimlich maneuver, right? And so those things are really obvious. We see someone in distress. But the majority of people that have swallowing disorders, especially in senior care, it's not an obvious thing. Sometimes it can be the three areas that we look at, or the symptoms that we look at most closely, are coughing during or right after they've swallowed, and then or like while they're eating. The second is a wet, gurgly voice. So have you ever talked to someone and you just want to like, oh, you've got something in your throat, like clear your throat, right?
Yeah.
So a wet, gurgly voice is going to be a sign that someone is having difficulty. And then the third is going to be actually someone clearing their throat frequently and then feeling like they have something stuck in their throat. Because the thing about swallowing that is so concerning is that just the anatomy of a human is such that there are two tubes that run down our throats. That one tube goes straight to our lungs and we breathe through it, and the other tube goes to our stomach, and that's where all of our food and liquids pass through. But they bump up right next to each other. And so there are a few processes that our bodies naturally do to protect that tube that goes to our lungs, our airway, from food and drink going down. And this is what we often call like when things go down the wrong way, that feeling like, oh my gosh, like you're gasping for air, you're coughing. It's because that's called aspiration, so that's called aspiration, when food or drink goes down into the airway. And as someone gets older, or as they have a medical condition like a stroke, like Parkinson's, those muscles don't work quite as quickly or as efficiently to cover the airway. And so it just leaves risk for things to go down the wrong way. And so as speech therapists, it is our job to carefully assess someone and make sure that we are setting them up so that they can be safe while also getting their nutrition needs met. And a lot of times, like especially in the past, a lot of speech therapists have been really focused on looking for those signs and symptoms as though that's confirming. Like if we see someone coughing or we see someone clearing their throat, it would be easy to assume that someone is aspirating. But the movement now is really, we want evidence, and that's backed up by research that sometimes people will cough. And sometimes we all will choke a little bit, like will things will go down the wrong way. We will have things kind of go into our lungs. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that we should restrict someone across the board. And so the way that we look for proof and objective evidence that this is actually happening are through video studies. So that is like it's called a modified barium swallow, where we take someone and sit them in front of an X-ray machine. And we give them food and drinks that have barium mixed in it. And that's just a white powdery kind of substance. And we can watch the food go down their throat and see, is it going to their lungs or is it going to their stomach? And the second test that we can do as a speech therapist is called the fiber optic endoscopic evaluation of swallow, or FEES. And this is a scope that we run through someone's nose and to the back of their throat. And it's a video camera that actually watches food and drink go down. And we can see if it's going, which tube it goes into. Yeah. And so that's a very specialty thing. Like not all speech therapists are trained to do those studies. But as someone in senior care, myself, I would refer some of my patients to these speech therapists that can do these really important videos and we will see evidence. Is this actually happening? So when a speech therapist is coming to, staff and we're talking in senior living, whether it's to the kitchen or to the nurse or to the activities, and we are saying, hey, there's this concern, hopefully that is with evidence from one of these tests, but it can be a very, very serious situation because any concerns, whether it's obviously like choking, which is covering someone's airway, that can obviously lead to death, but also aspiration, getting food or drink in your lungs can cause pneumonia, which for an elderly person or someone who is frail medically, that can also end their life. So these are very serious situations.
Yeah. With some of the newer techniques and direction things are going, how can someone, I think about, working in the senior living, somebody who maybe is just a dining room server, or they're a prep cook who is helping in the dining room one day. Should they be looking for some of these more traditional symptoms? And then how can they, or how should they communicate that to the right people? Because obviously they're going to be that first line of defense for us to be able to identify, hey, something's not quite right here. And what can they do to delineate between what you described as like something where maybe you or I was like, oh, it just went down the wrong tube, so to speak, one time, as versus someone who maybe is starting to develop some issues or some concerns. Today, I want to tell you about one of Tressel's senior living partners, Boelter. Boelter is a food service design, equipment, and supply company that has been providing expert guidance to the food and beverage industry for nearly a century. A strategic partner to the most successful food service operations in the country, Boelter provides support in kitchen and bar design, equipment procurement and install, and supplies. Their team of senior living food service experts have experience across the continuum of care. From independent living to skilled nursing and CCRCs, Boelter specializes in right-sizing new facilities, modernizing remodels, and providing the right food service equipment and supplies. At Boelter, they are committed to creating memorable experiences for their customers and their guests. With their top-notch team and a global network of quality supplier partners, their customer-focused approach is built on a foundation of collaboration and decades of industry experience. So thank you for considering Boelter for all of your food service needs.
Yeah, that's a great question because as a speech therapist, I rely on every staff member in my building to give me information to make sure that my patients are safe, whether it's coming from the maintenance man or an aide or an activities person. Like I don't care who it comes from. Like we all need to be aware of these situations. So yeah, for individuals who are just in the senior living space, those three things I mentioned are great kind of red flags to think about. So coughing, throat clearing, and a wet, gurgly voice. And if you notice these things, it is extremely important that you notify the speech therapist if there is one that's working full time in that building. But at the very least, notifying the nurse that is responsible for that resident of your concerns so that then they can refer to the speech therapist. And, we mentioned those are the signs of aspiration. That's the biggest concern with swallowing. But there are some other concerns, like if someone is chewing food for a really long time, they're keeping food in their mouth for 30 minutes or more, or they're doing what we call pocketing, which is where they keep food in the side, like in their cheeks.
Yeah.
Or maybe they're pulling food out, like they seem to have some kind of texture aversion. They chew and chew and chew, and then they eventually have to spit it out. Anything from where the food passes their lips to where when food empties into the stomach, any issue in that path is something that a speech therapist can assess and treat.
Yeah, some of those other ones, I think, are they more prevalent, or are they easier to identify, or the aspiration ones, the triggers that usually you see staff notifying and sharing?
I think it depends on the three signs I talked about that are signs for aspiration. Those are pretty frequently referred and consistently referred. But those other things, like the chewing for a long time or maybe pocketing. Those typically aren't red flags that people are super concerned about until it starts to maybe affect their weight, right? So if they're experiencing weight loss and they're showing those symptoms, that usually is a combination that can bring someone to bring it to my attention. But I recommend that, it shouldn't feel like your job, if you work in senior living in any capacity, to figure out what the problem is. If you just notice it, bring it to us, bring it to the speech therapist, and it's our responsibility to figure out, oh, is this something that is concerning or is it not? But if you are not a speech therapist, don't worry about it. Just raise the red flag and do that part of it, and don't worry about having to figure out, all the specifics.
Yeah, it sounds like, it makes sense. Just like if you see it, say something about it. And then the worst case scenario is it really means there's no issue. We've checked it out and the resident's fine. And so a little over caution never hurts in this situation, I think. So
Absolutely.
one of the things that I have experienced in my 20 some years in senior living is, especially in the food service lane, is there always tends to be a little bit of, I don't want to call it, territorialism or whatever. But, nursing and food service people sometimes can butt heads because there's obviously a lot of overlap in care when it comes to food and nutrition. And so, first, I'm sure you've experienced that. And I'm curious how you've been able to develop successful relationships with not just the directors of the department, but the team in the kitchen and the team on the floor working, because without them, your job obviously becomes harder, because if there's one speech therapist for the community, whereas there's 8, 10, 12, 15 food service workers. And so they need to be the eyes and ears. So how do you create those successful relationships with the food service team?
Yeah, I definitely have experienced that. It can be tough to have interactions when we don't understand each other's perspective. I think that is what I've taken away mostly from my relationships. In the last 9 years, I've worked in 8 different facilities. So I've worked with a lot of different kitchen teams. I've done a lot of travel therapy and things. So I look back at the beginning of my career, like when I first started, and I didn't understand the importance of the communication between myself and anyone involved in the kitchen, any dietary professional. I just kind of came in and said what I needed and walked away, like it was a very transactional relationship. Right. And what happened from that was that I rubbed people the wrong way. Although I am very active on social media, I'd create videos, I am an introvert, and I am not someone who loves a lot of small talk, how's your weekend and those kind of things. And so I think well, when I'm at work, I just do my job and I go home. And it came across as just kind of, I was being rude, hey, this was supposed to be mechanical soft and it's not, so fix it,
Yeah.
So I look back, I cringe at some of the interactions I had. So my best advice, regardless if you're a speech therapist or you're a kitchen staff, is to understand that we both have extremely important jobs, but our goal, and we have different responsibilities, but our goal is the same. We want to provide an experience for our residents that is enjoyable, that allows them to be safe, and allows them as much independence and choice as possible. And so if we can just kind of come together with that, and then, like I said, myself, I think interpersonal relationships are really important too when it comes to these kind of relationships that can sometimes be, one with some friction, is to just be kind to each other and just have some grace when we have tough days. And so, over the last couple of years, I think it's over the last 3 years, there's been a big rollout of a new diet framework. Mm-hmm. And that has caused a lot of stress. So in the past, we always had regular, mechanical soft, and puree. That were the 3 main food diets. but now it's called the International Dysphagia Diet, IDDSI.
Yeah,
And so it is, yeah, IDSI, and it's a 0 through 7 scale. It's no longer just like, oh, mechanical soft. It's like minced and moist, number 5. Like, it's so much more complex.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so a lot of speech therapists or registered dietitians have found themselves in the role of trying to implement this whole new way of thinking about food and this whole new process. And there's been a lot of friction for a lot of those relationships. Yeah. Yeah. And it's a learning process, but I think where the struggle comes most is when any kind of mistakes, it's not as easy on one side or the other to give grace, because they have such big consequences, of safety. And so, although yes, it is a very serious situation, I think we need to just kind of over communicate if we need to ask questions, provide training, and just I know that in the buildings where I had better just interpersonal relationships with the kitchen staff, I also had better buy-in and like better compliance, and my residents ultimately were safer.
Yeah, when I hear you say things like, being kind and kind of trying to understand that we have a similar goal, they sound simple, they sound very basic, but they're really not. They're really kind of, you've got to work at it. And it's a process. It's not just something that can like a switch overnight flip and you're ready and good to go.
And when we don't know what each other's job is, it's easy for me as a speech therapist to just come in and be like, come on, guys, your only job is to make food based on this card. Like, what's so hard about it, right?
Right.
And then I'm sure they're looking at me like, why are you so freaked out? Like, why are you so riled up about this situation? It was one mistake, and right. I think that's where we kind of come together and butt heads sometimes when we just are so single-minded, focused on what our specific role and responsibility is.
Yeah, it's so very true. And so one of the things you mentioned in there, and I wanted to shift a little bit to this just because I find it fascinating that you're doing this. You've become a social media influencer in this space. I talk a lot about like there's such a huge opportunity with social media, and don't do boring videos and post, and do things that are engaging. But you've taken it to a whole different level, and it really truly is like it's educational, it's engaging, and so I'm curious for you to tell us a little bit about how that happened and how you got into it, and what you're kind of doing with that now.
Navigator is the largest full-service GPO that exclusively focuses on the senior living community. And what that means is we provide products and services that help our members provide a great environment for their residents, such as like MRO, hospitality equipment, food, business products, as well as technology solutions. We actually surround our members with a level of support unmatched in the industry.
I accidentally became an influencer, I just want to say. It was never quite my goal, but in 2021, my husband and I were moving from Kentucky to Washington State. And prior to that, I'd spent 3 years working for a therapy company where I started creating dementia program for them with an occupational therapist I was working with. And we were spending 3 years just doing lots of training of therapists on how to work with people with dementia with more creativity and effectiveness and things like that. And so I'd been traveling and doing all these presentations, and I had all this, it was giving me an opportunity to be confident in the fact that like, hey, I know what I'm talking about with dementia. Like right. I started to become someone that has some authority in that area. And so when I moved to Washington, I really wanted to continue doing that kind of training, but in long-term care communities. And I just knew that when I knocked on the door of a nursing home and said, hey, I want to train your staff, they'd be like, well, you're a speech therapist. What do you know about anything? Right? Because like we said before, people don't understand what we do.
Right.
And so I started creating videos based on my own experience and training and everything of how to provide care for people with dementia in creative ways that worked. And I didn't even have like a personal Instagram before this. Like, I was not a social media person. And so I just started making videos to prove my expertise. I imagined being able to like, hey, pull out your phone and here's an example of my teaching style and my expertise. And I thought it would be a means to an end. But what happened within 9 months, I got 100,000 followers on Instagram and TikTok. And I was like, what is happening? Like, this is not quite the life that I thought I was going to have. But I very quickly realized that this information didn't exist like I was presenting it.
Yeah.
Very practical, easily digestible, but also evidence-based. Like, it's really important to me that everything I put out is backed by science. It is research-based. It's not just my opinion, you know? And so, yeah, I've been really consistent in posting over the last, almost 2 years. And I think I've got about 275,000 followers across my platforms.
Yeah. And one of the things I find about the videos you do is, and I think this is maybe why you've had such success, and tell me if I'm wrong, but they're not designed to talk specifically to someone working in a senior living community or a nursing home or somebody at home. They're a little bit more broad in their appeal, but very specific in what you cover. You know, like I know just recently you're going through this like thread of different items, and it's short, sweet, but it's the information that you can use whether you work in the industry or you're dealing with someone at home, or you know, it's just something you're curious about. And I think that approach has been really beneficial for those that are interested in learning more about it.
Yeah, I never want to assume that anyone that's watching this video has any background or like knows what I'm talking about. And so even just under 90 seconds, I try to present a problem. And it's very important to me that I not just say like, oh, here's a problem with people with dementia, but I say like, this is why it's happening, relate it back to neurology and what's happening in the brain, and then give a couple of like just simple tips and how we can help them experience the world in a way that's feels safer to them and therefore allows them to, you know, get their needs met better. And so, yeah, I want to raise awareness in just general society too. There's so many people who comment that's like, I don't know anyone with dementia, but I love watching your videos because one day I probably will. And, you know, I want to be ready.
Yeah, no, it's great to know that those are out there. What you've put together it's a huge resource for anybody who needs to know more about dementia, or like I said, wants to know more about dementia. And so, you know, we've come to the end of our time here today. And so, since we just talked about how big of an influencer you are, I would love for you to share how people can start following you if they don't, learn more about what you do, and connect with you if they have more questions about what a speech therapist can do and how it can support their communities.
Yeah. Yeah, I am on social media at BeLightCare. So BeLightCare. I'm on TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram. So if you type in BeLightCare, you will find me anywhere. I also have a website, belightcare.com, and you can read more about like my professional background, but also you can see what services I provide. I will do caregiver consultations many times a week with individuals who are caring for someone with dementia across the country. And we just talk about what issues they're having, and I give them some education and some information that might make things a little easier. So yeah, I have an Amazon like gift ideas for people with dementia, but also product recommendations. There's a lot of things, but if you follow me on social media, you will see all of that.
Very cool. Well, Adria, I appreciate your time today, diving into learning about speech therapists. I think that's something that we need to know more about and better understand, and how it works in dementia care, and being able to just share your wisdom in general and your experience. So thanks for joining me today here on Tips from Trestle.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It was a lot of fun.
So there you have it, another one in the books. Thanks again, everybody, for listening. Please follow, like, and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts, and follow us on Twitter at Tips from Trestle. You can also learn more about the work I do by following me on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and even TikTok. And be sure to check out Trestle Hospitality Concepts at www.trestlehospitalityconcepts.com. I'm your host, Aaron Fish, and this has been another episode of Tips from Trestle.